The Arizona Territory. Heat in the year of our Lord 1876 was a physical thing, a weight that settled on your shoulders the moment you stepped from the shade. In the town of San Judas, a place that was little more than a boil on the hide of the desert, the dust was a constant companion. It was a fine red powder that worked its way into the seams of your clothes, the lines of your face, and the back of your throat. The wind never stopped. It was a hot breath that whispered of drought and desperation, carrying the scent of creosote and sun-baked earth. All around the town, the saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to a pale, indifferent sky. They had been there for 100 years, and would be there for 100 more long after San Judas had been swallowed by the dust from which it came. May Bennett felt the eyes of the town upon her. She was used to it. Since the day she was born, the day her mother had died bringing her into the world, she had been marked. She was the bad luck child, the girl who carried a shadow with her. Her father, a man broken by grief and whiskey, had done little to dispel the notion. He had let the whispers fester until they became fact. May Bennett was misfortune walking in worn leather boots. Now her father was dead, and he had left her with one final gift, a debt to the most powerful man in San Judas, Sheriff Amos Pike. A debt she knew was a lie, a fiction cooked up to give the sheriff what he had always wanted, complete ownership of the last piece of Bennett land, the small plot with the only reliable well for 5 miles. She stood on the raw timber platform in front of the saloon, the makeshift auction block. Her hands were not tied, but they might as well have been. She felt the gaze of every man in that dusty street. They were not looking at her with pity or kindness. They were looking at her like she was a mule or a shovel, something to be bought and put to work. Sheriff Pike stood beside her, a big man whose bulk was turning to fat from too much whiskey and too little justice. His tin star was tarnished, and his smile was a greasy thing that never reached his cold little eyes. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the supposed ledger of her father's debts. He told the assembled crowd that it was a sad day, a day of reckoning, but that the law must be upheld. He explained that since Miss Bennett had no funds to clear her late father's considerable obligations, the town council had approved this measure. Her labor would be sold to the highest bidder for a term of 5 years to satisfy the debt. In the small crowd, May saw Silas Rourke. He was a merchant, a trader in guns and land, and most of all secrets. He was a thin man, a whisper of a man who could slide in and out of a room without anyone noticing. He was watching the proceedings with a predatory stillness, his eyes calculating the angles. He bought and sold misery, and today misery was cheap. May knew he was not there to bid. He was there to watch, to gather information he could sell later. A little farther back, leaning against the wall of the general store, was Hector Cruz. He was a vaquero, a horseman of singular skill whose family had worked this land for generations, long before it was called Arizona. He was a quiet man, his face a mask of stoic calm that revealed nothing. He wore the traditional clothes of his trade, and his posture was one of relaxed readiness. He did not look at May directly, but she felt his presence, a point of stillness in the swirling dust of her humiliation. He disapproved, she could feel it. But in San Judas, the disapproval of a Mexican vaquero was worth less than the dirt under a man's boots. He was an observer, nothing more. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat and announced that the bidding would begin. He said that 5 years of a strong young woman's labor was a prize indeed. He could have her working in the saloon or mending fences or whatever the winning bidder saw fit. His words were a physical assault, and May flinched. She looked out past the leering faces, past the ramshackle buildings of San Judas, to the vast, unforgiving landscape that stretched to the horizon. She had been born in this land, but it had never felt like home. It was a place to be endured, not lived in. A man from the railroad work camp made a low opening bid. Another man, a local rancher with a mean reputation and a wandering eye, raised it. The air grew thick with their greed. May felt a coldness spread through her, a numbness that was almost a comfort. She was detaching herself from the moment, floating above the dusty street, watching the sorry spectacle as if it were happening to someone else. It was the only way to survive. The bidding stalled. The railroad man grumbled and shook his head. The rancher grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. He was about to claim his prize. Sheriff Pike raised his gavel, a piece of an old wagon axle. He called out the final price, going once, going twice. May closed her eyes. She braced herself for the final thud of the gavel that would seal her fate. It never came. Instead, there was a sound, a sharp crack that was not a gavel. It was the report of a rifle. Wood splintered from the auction post not 6 inches from Sheriff Pike's head. He yelped and stumbled backward, falling in a heap in the dust. The crowd gasped and scattered like quail. May's eyes snapped open. At the edge of town, where the dusty street bled into the desert scrub, were 5 riders. They sat on their horses perfectly still, their figures shimmering in the heat. They were not cowboys or soldiers. They wore clothes of soft buckskin, and around their necks, each man wore an amulet made of seashells that glinted in the harsh sunlight. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on the center of town. They held their rifles with an easy familiarity. One of the riders spurred his horse forward a few paces. He raised a hand. He spoke, and his voice carried clear and steady across the sudden silence. He spoke first in Spanish, then in a language that was older than any other in this land, the tongue of the Apache. The words were different, but the message was the same. He told them to leave this land. He said it was the land of the Ndi, the people, and it was not for sale. He said they had been warned. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they turned their horses and melted back into the desert. They did not ride away in a cloud of dust. They simply vanished, becoming one with the heat and the distance. For a long moment, the town was silent. The only sound was the eternal whisper of the wind. Then the fear turned to anger. Men who had been hiding behind barrels and in doorways emerged, their faces flushed with a mixture of terror and outrage. Silas Rourke was the first to give the anger a name. He declared it was the Apache King. He said the man was a myth, a ghost story told to scare children, but that he was real and he was inciting the local tribes. Others took up the cry. They said the Apaches were getting bold, that the army needed to come and wipe them out. Sheriff Pike picked himself up, brushing the dust from his pants. His face was pale, but his eyes were burning with a new kind of avarice. He saw an opportunity. The fear of the townspeople was a tool he could use. He looked at May, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He announced to the crowd that the auction was postponed. He said they had a more pressing problem, the Apache threat. He declared that Sheriff Amos Pike would not stand for it. He said he would protect the good people of San Judas. He grabbed May by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He told the town that the girl was clearly a magnet for trouble. He said that perhaps the Apaches had an interest in her. He dragged her toward the jailhouse, his voice booming. He said he was placing her in protective custody. He would keep her safe. He would use her as bait. He would draw out this Apache King and put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. The townspeople cheered. They had their scapegoat and their hero all in one. May said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had been sold not to a rancher, but to the town's fear. She was no longer a person, just a piece of bait in a trap. The inside of the jail was a small, stifling box with one barred window. Night fell, but it brought no relief from the heat. The air was thick and still. May sat on the thin cot, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. She had traded one cage for another. The events of the day felt unreal, a fever dream. The riders with the seashell amulets, the warning, the sheriff's sudden transformation from auctioneer to savior. It was all a lie, a performance for the town. She knew Pike cared nothing for her safety or the town's. He cared only for the railroad money and the land he wanted to steal from her. This Apache threat was a gift to him, a perfect excuse to seize control. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she heard a faint sound, the scuff of a boot outside the jailhouse door. A key turned softly in the lock. The door creaked open. It was not Sheriff Pike. 2 men she had never seen before stood in the doorway, their faces hidden in shadow. They were rough men, hired muscle. One of them held up a lantern, and its light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He told her to be quiet and come with them. He said someone had paid a good price for her. Fear, a cold and familiar friend, washed over her. This was not part of the sheriff's plan. This was something else. She had no choice but to obey. They led her out of the jail and into the deserted street. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, offering little light. They moved quickly and silently toward the edge of town where 3 horses were waiting. One of the men told her she was going on a little trip. He said their employer was waiting for her at an old abandoned mine up in the hills. He said she would be very valuable to him. May's mind raced. An abandoned mine. A secret employer. It had to be Silas Rourke. It was his kind of play, a game of whispers and shadows. He had seen the sheriff take her and had decided to steal the bait from the trap for his own purpose. Ransom. He meant to ransom her. She did not know to whom or for what, but she knew it was his hand at work. They forced her onto one of the horses and tied her hands to the saddle horn. They rode out of San Judas and into the vast darkness of the desert. The landscape that was harsh and unforgiving by day was a place of deep and menacing shadows by night. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the ever-present wind. They rode for what felt like hours, following a narrow trail that snaked through a dry riverbed and arroyo with steep sandy walls. Suddenly, the man in the lead pulled his horse to a halt. He held up a hand for silence. He had heard something. May listened. At first there was nothing but the wind. Then she heard it too. A faint sound on the edge of hearing. The sound of shifting pebbles from the top of the arroyo wall. Before her captors could react, shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the canyon rim. Figures moved with a swift and silent grace. There was a soft whistle. Then another. The 2 men beside her cursed. One of them reached for his pistol, but he was too late. There was no gunfire. No shouting. Just the sound of a rope whistling through the air, a thud and a grunt. One of the men was pulled from his saddle and vanished into the darkness. The other man panicked. He spurred his horse trying to bolt, but another figure dropped from the canyon wall directly into his path. The horse shied and screamed, throwing its rider to the sandy ground. May sat frozen on her horse, her heart hammering against her ribs. Figures emerged from the darkness surrounding her. They were not wearing buckskin. They were not wearing seashell amulets. They were vaqueros, their faces covered with bandanas. One of them stepped forward and cut the rope binding her hands. Another man approached leading a horse. On the horse sat Hector Cruz. He looked at May, his expression unreadable in the faint moonlight. He gave her a slight nod, and then he spoke, his voice low and calm. He told her that it was not safe for her in San Judas. He said she was coming with him. The darkness before dawn was absolute, a velvet blackness that swallowed sound. May had spent the hours huddled in the hollow of the arroyo wall, listening to the wind scour the world above. Hector Cruz and his men were silent presences around her, their calm, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her own heart. They had given her water from a leather canteen and a piece of dried meat that she could not bring herself to eat. Questions swarmed in her mind, but she asked none of them. She was a leaf caught in a current, and for now all she could do was wait to see which way it would turn. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, the wind died down. A fine red dust settled over everything, coating their clothes, their hair, their skin. The air was still and cool, carrying the sharp, pungent scent of the creosote bush. A smell like desert rain. With the growing light, the world took shape again, the steep walls of the arroyo, the skeletal arms of Ocotillo on the rim above. It was in this ghostly twilight that the other riders arrived. They came not from the trail, but from the desert itself, materializing from the landscape as if they were born of it. It was the same group from the day before, the 5 men who had stopped her auction. They dismounted with a fluid economy of motion, their seashell amulets making no sound. The man who was their leader walked toward the small fire Hector's men had kindled. The others followed him. One was a woman, her face a beautiful mask of lines that spoke of wisdom and hardship. She carried a bundle of herbs on her back, and her eyes, which were dark and penetrating, missed nothing. She moved with the quiet confidence of one who understands the secrets of the earth. Another was a tall black man, broad of shoulder and long of limb. He wore the worn trousers of a United States cavalryman, but the coat was gone, replaced by a simple leather vest. His face was set in a permanent expression of sorrow, and his hands rested near a pistol on his hip, a gesture that was less a threat than a habit. He looked at May with a flicker of something she recognized: weariness, a deep and abiding exhaustion with the cruelty of the world. The leader stopped a few feet from her. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 35. His face was angular and strong, and his black hair was held back from his forehead by a simple leather band. He was covered in the same red dust as everyone else, and a cloth was wrapped around the lower half of his face, protecting him from the sandstorm. He stood looking down at the fire for a long moment, and May felt the intensity of his presence. This was the man they called the Apache King. Hector Cruz spoke to him in a low voice, a mixture of Spanish and the Apache tongue. The leader listened without moving, then gave a single sharp nod. He turned his head, and his eyes met May's for the first time. They were not the wild eyes of a savage that the stories told. They were clear, intelligent, and held a depth of stillness that was unsettling. The sun broke over the rim of the arroyo, casting the world in a bruised red light. As if taking a cue from the dawn, the man reached up and slowly unwrapped the cloth from his face. He shook the dust from it and looked at her again. His gaze was direct, unwavering. It felt as though he was not just looking at her, but into her, seeing the long, lonely years, the whispers, the label that had been hung around her neck like a stone: Unwanted. He spoke. His voice was a low rumble, and the English words were rough-shaped by a tongue more accustomed to other sounds. He asked a question that was not a question. Unwanted since birth. He paused, letting the words hang in the still morning air. His eyes never left hers. I looked once and knew. You are my destiny. The word destiny sounded strange coming from him. It was a white man's word, a word from books and poems, not a word for this raw and unforgiving land. May stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what he had said. It was absurd. A madman's pronouncement. She was nothing to him, a stranger, a white woman he had seen for a moment from a distance. The woman with the bundle of herbs let out a soft sound, and May saw her brow furrow in concern. The black soldier looked away toward the rising sun, as if embarrassed. May found her voice. It was thin and reedy. I do not know who you are or what you want, but you are mistaken. I need to go back to San Judas. I have to clear my name. Her words sounded foolish even to her own ears. Clear her name. In a town run by Amos Pike. The man's expression did not change. He seemed to consider her words carefully. San Judas. He said the name as if it were a foul taste in his mouth. There is no name to clear in a place of thieves. There is no law where the lawman is the greatest criminal. He believes this land belongs to him, to the railroad. He is wrong. I have to go back, she insisted, her voice gaining a little strength. They think I am some kind of accomplice to you, that I am a traitor. I have to prove them wrong. The former soldier spoke for the first time, his voice a deep baritone, weary but clear. The man's name is Ezekiel Ward. He told her, and this is Nahota. He is not a king. He is a Naatayaniai, a leader for his people. And he is right. There is nothing for you in that town but a rope or a cage. Then why did you bring me here? May asked, her gaze shifting from Ezekiel to Nahota. What do you want from me? Nahota answered for himself. I want nothing from you. The morning sun caught the sharp planes of his face. I saw you. I saw the spirits had put a mark on you, the same as they have put on me. Our paths are now one. That is the way of it. May shook her head in disbelief. She felt a rising tide of panic. These people were fanatics living in a world of spirits and signs. She was a prisoner as surely as she had been in Pike's jail or in the hands of Silas Rourke's men. I am not one of you. I want to go home. Home. The woman spoke now. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. The one they called Tozinha looked at May with a pity that was almost worse than the men's intensity. That place was never your home, child. You were just a ghost haunting it. Before May could reply, a new sound cut through the morning stillness. Faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the sound of a bugle, a military call echoing off the canyon walls. Ezekiel Ward stiffened his hand, dropping instinctively to his pistol. Cavalry. He said the word under his breath, a curse, but it is too soon. Nahota's calm finally broke. He moved with sudden urgency, speaking in rapid Apache to his men. They began to gather their horses, kicking dirt over the small fire. Hector Cruz and his vaqueros were already mounting up, ready to ride. "It is Pike," Ezekiel explained to May, his voice tight. "He has hired guns with him. They tracked us." Nahota came to her and grabbed the reins of her horse. He looked not at her, but up at the rim of the arroyo. "There is no time. You will ride with us." "No, I will stay. I will talk to them. I will explain," May protested, pulling back on the reins. Nahota turned his head and fixed her with a look of such fierce intensity that her words died in her throat. "You will explain nothing. To him you are a tool, a piece of bait. Nothing more. Now come." He did not wait for her answer. He tugged her horse forward, leading it toward a narrow, barely visible crack in the far wall of the arroyo. It was not a trail, it was a fissure, a scar in the rock just wide enough for a single horse to pass through. The others fell in line behind them, a silent procession of ghosts, fleeing the coming dawn. The path was treacherous. It climbed steeply, the horse's hooves slipping on the loose rock. May had to lean forward, clutching the saddle horn to keep from falling. The air grew thin and cold as they ascended. Below them, the floor of the arroyo grew smaller and smaller. They were moving through a world of stone and shadow, a secret path known only to the people of this land. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the silence broken only by the labored breathing of the horses and the clatter of dislodged stones. As they rounded a sharp bend in the narrow canyon, Nahota's horse stumbled. A leather saddlebag came loose and fell to the ground, spilling some of its contents. Nahota dismounted quickly, scooping up the items. But in the brief moment they lay on the rocky ground, May saw them clearly. There were pouches of herbs, a small knife, and a rolled document tied with a leather thong. It had come partially unrolled when it fell. It was a map. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the lines and symbols. It was a survey map of the territory. She saw the familiar curve of the San Pedro River, the cluster of mountains they called the Dragoons. And she saw new lines drawn in thick black ink lines that cut across the land, enclosing a huge swath of it. Lines that ran directly through the valley, where her family's small plot of land and its well were located. It was a map for a new reservation, a place to contain the Apache. But it was the writing at the bottom of the map that made the blood run cold in her veins. It was a formal approval, a signature that was both elegant and arrogant. A signature she had seen many times on eviction notices and false tax levies. It was the signature of the man who had tried to sell her into servitude, the man who was at that very moment hunting her with a posse of killers. Authorized by Sheriff Amos Pike. Ezekiel Ward saw the look on her face. He saw her staring at the map as Nahota secured it back in his saddlebag. Ezekiel's expression was grim. "Now you see," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper above the wind whistling through the rocks. "It is not just your well he wants. It is all of it. He means to sell the very soul of this land and call it justice." The high country of the Mogollon Rim was another world. The thick, hot air of the low desert had been replaced by a thin cold that scraped at the lungs. They had ridden through the last of the day and deep into the night, climbing into a sky that was black and brilliant with stars. The heavens were a spill of white fire so dense and close it felt as though you could reach up and scoop them into your hands. There was no moon, only the cold light of the cosmos. The silence was profound, a ringing emptiness that made the world feel new and vast. May rode huddled in the thin blanket Tozinha had given her. Every muscle in her body ached a deep and weary protest. The sight of the map was burned into her mind, a spiderweb of ink that represented a greed so vast it was difficult to comprehend. Sheriff Pike was not just a small-town tyrant. He was a king in his own right, carving up a territory he did not own, selling a future that did not belong to him. And she, her small piece of land with its precious well, was just a pawn in this enormous game. Their path was blocked. A recent rock slide had torn away the trail, leaving a treacherous slope of rubble and loose shale. To go around would take days they did not have. Nahota dismounted and studied the obstacle, his face impassive in the starlight. He spoke quietly to his men, and they began to move without question. They worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice, their movements sure and economical. Ezekiel Ward slid from his horse and began to help, leading the animals one by one across the most stable parts of the slide. The horses were nervous, their eyes wide, their hooves sending small cascades of rock skittering into the darkness below. As Ezekiel led the horse that May rode, the animal panicked. It reared up, its iron-shod hoof lashing out. Ezekiel shoved May clear of the danger, but the hoof caught him high on the calf, tearing through his canvas trousers and the flesh beneath. He grunted in pain, but did not cry out. He calmed the horse with a low murmur and a firm hand, then led it to safety before he limped to a nearby boulder and sat down heavily. In the starlight, May could see the dark stain spreading on his pant leg. Tozinha was instantly at his side, her hands already reaching for the bundle of herbs she carried. But May moved just as quickly. She knelt in the dirt beside Ezekiel. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Tozinha paused and looked at Nahota, who gave a slight imperceptible nod. The woman stepped back, watching. May tore a long strip from the hem of her worn petticoat. She had no whiskey to clean the wound, so she used the last of the clean water from her own canteen, pouring it gently over the gash. Ezekiel flinched but did not pull away. The cut was deep and ragged, bleeding freely. She pressed the cloth against it, applying steady pressure. She worked with a focus she did not know she possessed. Her hands, which had so often felt clumsy and useless, were now steady and sure. For the first time in her life, she was not a burden. She was not a jinx. She was useful. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her father, drunk and angry after a bad turn at cards, had pointed a trembling finger at her and called her his curse, his punishment from God. The memory was sharp and painful as a shard of glass. But then it faded, replaced by the reality of the moment. The feel of the warm blood on her hands, the rough texture of the cloth, the sight of the man watching her with a new expression in his eyes. He watched her with something that looked almost like gratitude. She bound the wound tightly using another strip of cloth. It was a clumsy bandage, but it would hold. When she was done, she looked up and met the gaze of Ezekiel. His face was beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear. He gave her a slow nod. "Thank you." He said the two words, a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them. A seed of trust had been planted in the cold, rocky ground. They continued their journey, but their pace was slower now. Their water was gone, and the morning sun brought a dry heat that baked the rocks around them. Thirst became a living thing, a constant ache in the back of the throat. Nahota led them off the trail and into a grove of prickly pear cactus, the kind with wide, flat pads. He dismounted and with his knife began to methodically slice off several of the pads. He brought one to May and showed her how to hold it steady while he scraped away the long, sharp thorns with the side of his blade. He then cut a small slit in the top of the thick pad and handed it to her. He gestured for her to squeeze. A thick, clear liquid oozed from the cut. It did not look like water, but it was wet. May put it to her lips. The taste was green and strange, but it was moisture and it was life. She drank deeply. She watched as he taught her how to find the right pads, how to handle them without getting stuck by the almost invisible glochids, the tiny hair-like spines that were worse than the large ones. He spoke little, but his movements were a language all their own, a conversation with the land that he was now sharing with her. Later that day, he knelt and pointed to the ground. He showed her a set of tracks in the sandy soil. "Coyote," he said. "He runs this way. To water." He explained how the coyote would always find the surest path, the one that wasted the least amount of energy. He showed her how to read the depth of the print to know how recently the animal had passed. To follow the coyote, he said, is to learn the secret map of the land. She listened, and she learned. In San Judas, she had learned to be invisible, to make herself small, to expect nothing. Here, in this vast wilderness, She was learning to see, to listen, to survive. The world was opening up to her, revealing itself in the tracks of an animal, the shape of a cactus, the color of the rock. It was a harsh and demanding teacher, but a fair one. It did not judge her for who her father was or the day she had been born. It cared only if she had the strength to endure. That evening, as they made a cold camp in the shelter of a rock overhang, the threat of their pursuers returned. One of the Apache scouts who had been trailing behind them rode into camp. He spoke in low, urgent tones to Nahota. When he was finished, Nahota turned to the others, his face grim. "They are still behind us," he said. "But it is not Pike or his hired guns now." The scout found different tracks. 3 riders. They move like the Yuma. Ezekiel Ward, who was sitting with his bandaged leg propped up on a rock, looked up sharply. "Yuma? Are you certain?" Nahota nodded. "They know the old ways. They can track a ghost across bare rock. Silas Rourke sent them. The scout found one of their camps. Rourke has offered a great reward for us. A reward for each of our heads. He wants proof of the deed." The ugly words hung in the air. May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This was no longer just a chase. It was a hunt. They were the prey. Rourke had tired of his games of ransom and had moved on to a more direct solution. He wanted them dead, all of them. They pushed on through the night, moving as quickly as the injury of Ezekiel would allow. They traveled without a fire, their path lit only by the stars. They were ghosts, moving through a land of ghosts. Just before dawn, they reached the edge of the high plateau. The ground fell away before them in a series of cliffs and canyons. The view was immense, stretching for 100 miles under the paling sky. And it was there that they saw it. At first, it was just a faint line in the distance, a scratch on the surface of the vast landscape. But as the sun rose, its light caught the glint of metal and the scar of a newly turned earth. It was a line of wooden stakes driven into the ground, running in a perfectly straight line, from east to west as far as the eye could see. Beside it, a wide swath of desert scrub had been cleared away, leaving a raw red wound on the land. "The railroad," Ezekiel said, his voice a low growl of anger. Nahota stood beside him, a still silent figure looking out at the line that cut through the heart of his people's hunting grounds. It was the physical manifestation of the map May had seen. It was the iron promise of the white man's world, a world of fences and deeds and laws that served only the men who wrote them. The line was a dagger aimed at the heart of the Apache. The proposed reservation land was on the far side of it, a wasteland of rock and alkali flats where nothing could grow and no game could live. The railroad would be a wall, a barrier to keep them penned in their open-air prison, while Pike and Rourke grew rich selling off the fertile land, the land that had been stolen. May stood beside Nahota and Ezekiel, looking at the survey line. She finally understood. This was not about a single well or a piece of land. It was not even about her. It was about the collision of 2 worlds. One world that saw the land as something to be owned, to be divided and sold, and another that saw it as a living thing, a mother, a source of life to be respected and shared. She saw the brutal logic of the greed of men like Pike and Rourke. They were not just stealing land. They were stealing a way of life. They were trying to erase a people. And she, now a girl wanted by no one, was standing in the middle of it. The return to San Judas was a deliberate act of walking back into the fire. The sun was a hammer in the sky, beating down on the single dusty street. The air was thick with heat and the lazy buzzing of flies. Tacked to the public notice board outside the sheriff's office was a new piece of paper, a wanted poster. It offered a staggering sum for the capture, dead or alive, of the man known as the Apache King. The drawing was a crude caricature, a savage face with wild eyes that looked nothing like the calm, steady gaze of Nahota. It was another lie in a town built on them. May had made her choice on the high rim of the Mogollon. To keep running was to accept the story they had written for her, the unwanted girl, the jinx, the traitor. She would not run anymore. She would face the lie head on. It was a terrifying thought, but the fear was different now. It was not the hollow, helpless fear of a victim, but the sharp, focused fear of a fighter. Ezekiel and Hector had argued against it, but they had also seen the change in her. They saw the steel that had been forged in the high country, and they had agreed to stand with her as witnesses. She walked with her head held high, not with arrogance, but with a simple refusal to be ashamed. She ignored the stares, the whispers, the fingers pointed in her direction. Her destination was the saloon, the center of public life in San Judas, and the place where Amos Pike held his unofficial court. He was there as she knew he would be a pitcher of beer in front of him, his bulk overflowing the chair. Silas Rourke was with him, a shadow at his shoulder. Several of the railroad men and local ranchers were at the bar, their talk falling silent as she entered. The air grew thick with hostility. May walked directly to the sheriff's table. Hector and Ezekiel followed her, their presence a silent challenge. They stood just inside the doorway, their hands near their hips, their expressions unreadable. "I have come to file a formal complaint. Sheriff," May's voice was clear and steady. It did not tremble. "I am accusing you of fraud, of manufacturing a debt to steal my family's land." Pike let out a great booming laugh that was entirely without humor. "A complaint," he sneered, wiping beer from his lips with the back of his hand. "Girl, you are in no position to be making complaints. You are an accomplice to a murderous savage. You should be in a cell. I have witnesses who can attest to my abduction from your jail." May gestured to Ezekiel. "And witnesses who can attest that you yourself declared your intention to use me as bait, not to protect me." Pike's eyes narrowed. His amusement was fading, replaced by a flush of anger. He was not used to being challenged, certainly not by her. He sought an ally in the room, and his eyes landed on the town preacher, a small, nervous man named Reverend Johnson, who was nursing a glass of sarsaparilla in the corner. "Reverend," Pike called out, his voice taking on a righteous tone, "tell this girl about the importance of law and order. Tell her how civilization is built upon respecting the authority that God has placed over us. Tell her that consorting with heathens is a path to damnation." The Reverend stood up, clutching a small Bible. He cleared his throat and began to speak of civic duty and the sanctity of contracts, his words a weak and practiced sermon that everyone in the room had heard 100 times before. May let him speak. When he finally trailed off into a nervous silence, she turned her attention back to Pike. "You talk of contracts. Let us talk of the one you held over my father, the one he supposedly signed giving you claim to his land if he defaulted on a debt. You held something else over him as well, did you not? Something you used to force his hand." Pike's face went pale under his sunburnt flesh. He said nothing. "I think it was a birth certificate." May continued, her voice dropping slightly, forcing the men in the room to lean in to hear. "A forged one. One that listed my mother not as the good church-going woman she was, but as someone else. Someone whose name would have brought shame to my father. You kept it as insurance, did you not, Sheriff? A way to control him." Silas Rourke made a small, almost imperceptible movement, a shifting of his weight. Pike's hand trembled as he reached for his beer. "How would you know about that?" he growled. "Because I found it." May lied. She had not found it. She was guessing. But she was guessing based on the kind of man she knew him to be. A man who collected secrets and used them as weapons. The look on his face told her she had hit the mark. "When I clear my father's name, I am sure the territorial marshal will be very interested to see a document like that, a document forged by a town sheriff." Pike slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses. "It is a lie!" he roared. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for support. "This is what happens when you let women and savages run wild. They upend the natural order of things." "Perhaps," a quiet voice said from the doorway. "Perhaps the order of things in this town is what needs upending." Hector Cruz stepped forward from the shadows. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. "I was there the day the sheriff had your father sign the final papers. I was bringing horses to the livery. I saw it through the window. Your father did not want to sign." "He was a drunk, a coward," Pike spat. "He was a man grieving," Hector corrected him. "And he was a man being threatened. The sheriff had a paper he said would ruin your mother's good name. And when your father still refused, the sheriff took his thumb and forced it onto the ink pad." "That is his mark," Pike bellowed, pointing a sausage-like finger at May. "He made his mark on the contract. It is legal." But the sheriff was not satisfied with just the ink. Hector continued, his voice never rising but cutting through the tension in the room. "He wanted your father to remember the lesson. So he took a knife from his desk, held it in the flame of the lamp until it was glowing, and he pressed it to your father's thumb right after he made his mark. He said it was to seal the deal." The saloon was utterly silent. "If you look at that contract, Sheriff," Hector said, his eyes locking with Pike's, "I think you will find more than just an ink print on it. I think you will find the scar of a burn." The truth of it hit the room like a physical blow. Pike was exposed, his cruelty laid bare for all to see. He was not a lawman. He was a predator. The spell of silence was broken by the sharp crack of a pistol. One of the men Rourke had brought with him had drawn his gun and fired a shot into the ceiling, raining plaster dust down on the crowd. "It is lynch law, then." Rourke said, his voice a dry whisper. "The girl is a traitor and the Mexican is a liar. They stand with the Apache. String them up." The words were a spark in a tinderbox. The fear and anger that had been simmering in the town found their target. The crowd surged forward, their faces twisted into masks of mob fury. Pike's exposure had not shamed them. It had enraged them. He was their sheriff, and his humiliation was their own. Ezekiel Ward drew his own pistol, his back against the wall beside Hector. They were trapped, outnumbered 10-1. The first man reached for May, his hands like claws. And then a sound unlike any other ripped through the air. It was not a gunshot, but it was made by a gun. It was a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the floorboards and the very bones of everyone in the room. Bong! The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that the entire mob froze in its tracks, looking around in confusion. Bong! It came again, louder this time. Every head turned toward the small church at the end of the street. From the bell tower, the great iron bell was swinging wildly, as if rung by a giant. But there was no one there. Then they saw him. On the roof of the livery stable across from the church stood Nahotya. He held a rifle in his hands. He was not aiming at the crowd. He was aiming at the bell. As they watched, he fired again. Bong! The sound was a hammer blow that shattered the mob's rage into 1,000 pieces of bewildered silence. In that moment of stunned inaction, 2 horses appeared at the side of the saloon, led by one of Nahotya's men. Hector grabbed May, pulling her toward the door. Ezekiel provided cover, his pistol holding the mesmerized crowd at bay. Nahotya fired one last time. This shot was different. It did not strike the bell. It struck the rope that held it. With a final deafening crash, the great bell tore loose from its housing and plunged through the roof of the church tower, vanishing from sight. The sudden silence that followed was more shocking than the noise had been. Nahotya was gone from the rooftop. By the time the crowd recovered their senses, May was on a horse with Hector pulling her along, and Ezekiel was riding beside them, galloping out of town. As they cleared the last of the buildings and rode past the new railroad depot, May saw it. Silas Rourke was standing on the platform, talking to a railroad official. He was holding a sheaf of papers in his hand, land grant deeds, and he was pointing not to the empty desert but to a spot on the map the official held, a place in the foothills, a place marked by a small blue circle. It was the location of the sacred spring, the place where the Apache had gone for generations, for water, for healing, for prayer. It was the lifeblood of Nahotya's people. And Silas Rourke, with a railroad deed and a government stamp, was about to kill it. The Grama Grass Valley stretched before them like a sea of gold under the late afternoon sun. The air was heavy and still so thick you could feel it pressing on your skin. Far to the west, thunderheads were building mountains of bruised purple cloud that promised violence, but no relief. It was the season of dry lightning, when the sky spat fire without the grace of rain. A herd of longhorn cattle grazed uneasily in the distance, their heads low, their tails twitching as if they could sense the tension in the air. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The confrontation in San Judas had changed everything. It had drawn a line in the dust, making enemies into targets and turning a fight for land into a fight for life itself. May felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the master. She had spoken the truth in that saloon, and for the first time she had felt the power of it. She had not won, not yet, but she had fought back. Nahota rode a little ahead of her. His posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, reading the subtle language of the wind in the grass, the movement of a hawk in the sky. He had not spoken of his dramatic rescue, his display of marksmanship that had stunned an entire town. He did not need to. It was simply what he had done because it had been necessary. May found herself watching him, the way his hands rested on the reins, the quiet strength in his shoulders. He had called her his destiny, a word she still could not comprehend. But she was beginning to understand that his world was one of signs and connections where the flight of an eagle or the shape of a cloud could hold deep meaning. Perhaps he had seen something in her that she had never seen in herself. A flicker of light on the horizon was their only warning. It was followed a long moment later by a low rumble that was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground and into the hooves of their horses. The cattle herd lifted their heads as one, 1,000 pairs of horns turning toward the west. Another flash brighter this time. A jagged spear of white light stabbed down from the sky and touched the dry grass. At first it was just a puff of smoke, a small dark flower blooming on the golden sea. But the wind was a willing accomplice. It breathed on the spark, and the spark became a flame, and the flame became a wall of fire that began to race across the prairie with terrifying speed. The cattle panicked. A low moan of fear became a deafening roar as the entire herd turned and stampeded away from the fire directly toward them. The ground began to shake. It was not a stampede, it was an earthquake of living flesh and bone, a thundering tide of horns and hooves that would crush anything in its path. There was no time to think. Nahota yelled a single word in Apache, a command that sent his riders scattering. Hector Cruz grabbed the reins of May's horse, pulling her along with him as they galloped for the shelter of a rocky outcropping to the north. Ezekiel Ward, his injured leg making him the slowest, fell in behind them, his face a grim mask of determination. The fire moved faster than the cattle. It was a living thing, a monstrous orange beast that devoured the grass with a deafening roar. Smoke billowed into the sky, turning the afternoon into a hellish twilight. The heat was a physical blow that seared the skin and stole the breath from the lungs. May clung to her horse, her eyes streaming from the smoke, her heart pounding with a primal terror. They reached the rocks just as the edge of the stampede thundered past them. The smell of terrified animals and burning hair filled the air. They were trapped between the unstoppable force of the herd and the all-consuming fire. Nahota appeared through the smoke, his face blackened with soot. He pointed toward a narrow game trail that led up into the rocks. It was their only chance. They spurred their horses up the trail, the fire licking at their heels. The smoke was a choking blanket that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It was a blind, desperate flight. They emerged from the worst of the smoke onto a high stony ridge. Below them, the valley was an ocean of flame. The fire had swept through the entire basin, leaving nothing but blackened earth in its wake. They had escaped, but they were cut off. They spent the rest of the day and into the evening making their way along the ridge. The world was a landscape of ash and smoke. The fire had burned itself out against the far side of the valley, but the air was still thick with the smell of its passing. They found a small spring, a trickle of life in the desolation, and watered their exhausted horses. As they rested, May sat a little apart from the others, looking out at the ruin of the valley. The devastation was absolute. It reminded her of her own life, a thing that had been burned to the ground, leaving only the hope of new growth to come. Nahota came and sat on a rock near her. He did not speak for a long time. He simply shared the silence with her. "It reminds me of another fire," he said finally, his voice low and rough with smoke. "A long time ago, the soldiers came to our winter camp. They said we had broken a treaty, a piece of paper we had never seen. They came with fire." He fell silent again, and May knew that he was seeing it all again in his mind. "My brother was very young. He was fast like a deer. When the soldiers came, he ran. I told him to hide in the reeds by the river. I thought he would be safe there. But the fire was faster. May felt a deep ache in her chest, a sorrow that was not just for him, but for the endless cruelty of the world. She thought of her own losses. Her mother, a woman she had never known. Her father, a man she had known too well. The home that had never been a home. For the first time, she felt that her own small grief was part of a much larger one, a great river of pain that flowed through the land. "I am sorry." She said the words were inadequate, but they were all she had. He turned and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a warrior or a king, but a man who carried a terrible wound. And she understood that this fight, this struggle to save the sacred spring, was not just about land or water. It was about refusing to lose anything more. It was about protecting the last embers of a dying fire. The sky finally broke. The rain came not with a gentle patter, but with a sudden violent deluge. It hissed on the hot rocks and turned the ash into a black slurry. They scrambled for shelter, finding a shallow cave under a ledge of rock. It was not much, but it was dry. They huddled together in the darkness, their clothes soaked, their bodies shivering with cold and exhaustion. The rain fell in a solid curtain outside the cave mouth, a drumming that shut out the rest of the world. May's teeth chattered uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. The cold was deep in her bones. Nahata moved closer to her. He was a source of warmth in the damp chill. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was wet and cold like hers, but there was a strength in his touch that was a comfort. He did not say anything. He just held her hand. Then he shifted his position and put his arm around her, pulling her against his side. It was a simple gesture born of necessity, a sharing of body heat to ward off the cold. But in the darkness of the cave, with the sound of the rain all around them, it was something more. It was a moment of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in fire and flight. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since she was a small child, she felt safe. The world outside was a place of violence and greed. But in this small space, in the heart of the storm, there was a fragile peace. She closed her eyes, and the darkness that came was not one of fear, but of rest. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, and the air was fresh and cool. As they prepared to ride out, Ezekiel Ward stood with May, looking at the black scar of the valley below. "It makes a man think," he said, his voice heavy. "When I was a soldier, a buffalo soldier, we were sent to a village not unlike the one Nahata described. Our orders were to protect the new settlers in the area. We were told the people in that village were dangerous, that they were raiding the homesteads, that they were a threat to the law." He picked up a small burnt stick and turned it over in his hands. "We followed our orders. We rode in at dawn. We set fire to the lodges. The people who ran out, we considered them hostiles. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Later we found out the truth. The raids had been done by white men trying to scare the settlers off so they could claim the land for themselves. The people in the village were innocent. We had followed the law, but we had not done justice." He threw the stick down in disgust. "That was the day I left the army. I have been wandering ever since. I owe Nahata a debt. He found me half dead in the desert, and his people gave me water and food. But it is more than that. In him I see a man fighting for real justice, not the kind that is written on a piece of paper by men like Amos Pike." Just then one of the Apache scouts came riding hard into their camp. He slid from his horse, his face grim with the urgency. He spoke rapidly to Nahata. A new tension filled the air. Nahata turned to them, his expression hard as flint. "Rourke is not waiting for the government. He has brought his own men. They are building a spur line from the main track. And the army is sending a detachment of soldiers to protect the work crew. They plan to build a fort. They will break ground in 3 days." He looked toward the distant hills where the sacred spring lay hidden. "He is building his fort right on the banks of our spring. He means to choke the life out of us." Dawn arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper. The light seeped into the world from the east, a pale silver that touched the tops of the ancient stones first. They stood in a great circle on a small rise above the spring, a formation that looked like a necklace dropped by a giant long ago. The water of the spring itself was clear and cold, bubbling up from the heart of the earth and spilling into a series of shallow pools fringed with watercress and mint. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and the faint musical call of sandhill cranes that were feeding in the wetlands below. This was the place the mountain remembered their name. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary. Tozinha prepared for the ceremony. She laid out a small deerskin bundle, and from it took a pinch of pollen, a sacred eagle feather, and a small clay bowl. She did not invite the others to join her, nor did she exclude them. The ritual was a private conversation with the spirits of this place. Ezekiel Ward and Hector Cruz stood at a respectful distance, their heads bowed. May felt a powerful urge to step into the circle to be a part of the blessing. She felt that she too needed a prayer said for her, a cleansing of the bad luck that had clung to her for so long. But she resisted. She knew that this was not her ceremony, not her history. To step into that circle would be a kind of theft, a borrowing of something she had not earned. So she stood just outside the ring of stones, a silent observer. She could not understand the ancient words that Tozinha chanted in a low musical voice, but she could feel their power. She could feel the reverence, the deep connection to this place that flowed from the woman like water from the spring. And in her quiet act of respect, she felt a different kind of belonging. She was not one of them, but she was with them. When the sun had cleared the horizon and the ceremony was complete, they gathered to make their plan. The news that Rourke was bringing in the army had changed the nature of the fight. "We cannot fight soldiers in a railroad," Ezekiel said, his voice flat with the certainty of a man who knew the odds. "A direct confrontation would be a suicide. They have the guns, the numbers, and the law, such as it is, on their side." Nahota nodded, his gaze fixed on the bubbling spring as if memorizing its every detail. "He is right. To fight them with arrows and rifles would only prove their lies about us correct. It would give them the excuse they need to wipe us out." "Then what do we do?" Hector asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "We cannot simply let them take this place. We will fight them not with bullets, but with the truth," Nahota said, turning to face them. "Rourke and Pike are thieves, but they are also arrogant. They believe they are above the law they pretend to serve. Men like that always keep records. They write down their crimes." "A ledger?" May said the word aloud. "You think there is a ledger?" Nahota looked at her, and for the first time since the fire, there was a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. Years ago, before Rourke came into his full power, he had a partner, a man he cheated and ruined. That man told my father that Rourke kept a book, a black book, where he recorded every bribe, every false deed, every threat he used to build his empire. The man said Rourke was too proud of his cleverness to ever destroy it. "If such a book exists," Ezekiel mused, "and if we could get our hands on it along with the forged map and the coerced contracts, it would be enough to bring the territorial marshal down on them. It would be enough to stop the railroad." "It is a desperate chance," Nahota admitted. "The book would be well hidden, likely in the safe in Rourke's office in San Judas." The plan was madness. To go back into that town now after everything that had happened was to walk into the wolf's den. But it was the only plan they had. It was a single thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. They were preparing to leave when the attack came. It came without warning. Not with the thunder of a cavalry charge, but with the quiet whisper of a thrown knife. It struck the tree just beside Hector's head, quivering in the wood. The bounty hunters, the 3 Yuma trackers Rourke had hired. They had found them. The fight was a chaotic blur of motion and violence in the dappled sunlight by the spring. The trackers were skilled and silent, moving through the trees like phantoms. But Nahota and his men were fighting on sacred ground for a sacred purpose. They fought with a ferocity that was born of desperation. Ezekiel, his legs still stiff, moved with a deadly economy, his pistol barking in the quiet air. Hector engaged one of the men in a brutal dance of knives. The man was quick, but Hector was quicker. He disarmed his opponent, but not before the man's blade slashed across his arm, a deep but not life-threatening wound. It was over in minutes. One of the bounty hunters lay dead. The other 2 had vanished back into the wilderness from which they had come. They had failed to claim their prize, but they had succeeded in delaying them. And that delay would prove to be their undoing. As Tozinha was tending to the wound on Hector's arm, a new group of riders appeared. They were not bounty hunters. They were a patrol of 5 soldiers, their blue uniforms and yellow stripes a stark intrusion on this sacred place. They were a border patrol, their faces hard and suspicious. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant with a thick mustache, held up his hand. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes taking in the scene, the armed Apache, the wounded Mexican, the dead man on the ground. "This is a private matter," Ezekiel said, stepping forward, his hands held open to show he was not a threat. "We were attacked. We were defending ourselves." The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he looked at Nahota. "I know you," he said. "You are the one they call the Apache King. There is a warrant for your arrest, issued this morning, for inciting a riot in San Judas." "It is a lie," May cried out, stepping forward. "He stopped the riot. He saved my life." The sergeant ignored her. His focus was entirely on Nahota. "I have my orders. You are to come with us." Nahota looked at his people. He saw the fire in their eyes, the willingness to fight to die for him right here, right now. And he knew that was a sacrifice he could not allow. To fight these soldiers would be to start a war they could not win. He had to trust the plan. He had to trust May. He made a small, almost invisible gesture with his hand, a command for his people to stand down. He looked at May. His eyes were not filled with fear or anger, but with an urgent message. The book. Find the book. It was a look of complete and total trust, a trust that was a heavier weight than any she had ever known. He then turned to the sergeant and said in his rough English, "I will go with you. There will be no more fighting here." The soldiers took his rifle and tied his hands. They put him on his horse and led him away. May watched until he was gone, a disappearing figure against the vast indifference of the landscape. She was alone. They were all alone. The heart of their resistance had just been cut out. For a moment she felt the old familiar despair wash over her, a desire to curl up and let the world have its way. But then she felt the weight of the look he had given her, a look of trust. He had put his life, his people's future, in her hands. She would not fail him. "I will go," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper that grew stronger as she spoke. "I will get the book." "It is too dangerous," Hector protested, his face pale from his wound. "She has to," Ezekiel said, his voice grim. "She is the only one who can. Rourke and Pike will not see her as a threat. They will see her as a foolish girl. It is our only advantage." They gave her the small bundle of evidence. They had the forged map and the coerced contracts. She tucked them safely inside her shirt. She took the fastest horse and rode as if the devil himself were chasing her. But she was not riding away from trouble. She was riding directly into its heart. She did not ride for San Judas. She rode for Fort Endicott, the nearest army outpost. She would not put her faith in the corrupt law of the town. She would put her faith in the United States Army. She would find an officer, an impartial man, a man of honor, and she would give him the evidence. She would tell him the whole story. The army would have to investigate. They would see the truth. The fort was a stark and imposing structure, a square of adobe walls and wooden ramparts set against the endless blue of the sky. It was a symbol of order and authority in a wild land. A sentry directed her to the office of the commanding officer, a Captain Thorne, who was in charge of the investigation into the recent unrest. She was ushered into a small, neat office. Captain Thorne stood up to greet her. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, his uniform crisp, his buttons polished. He had a kind face and a polite manner that immediately put her at ease. She had been right to come here. This was a man of reason, a man of the law. She poured out the whole story, her words tumbling over one another in her urgency. She told him of the false debt of the attempted auction, of her abduction, of Nahota's innocence. She showed him the map and the contracts. He listened patiently, his expression one of serious concern. He examined the documents carefully. "This is a most serious set of accusations. Miss Bennett," he said when she was finished, his voice was grave, "it is clear that a full investigation is warranted. You have been very brave to come forward. You have done the right thing." A wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy washed over May. It was going to be all right. Justice would be done. The captain walked to a cabinet on the far side of the room. "I will need to secure this evidence," he said. He took out a small metal lockbox. As he was placing the documents inside, a man emerged from a back room of the office. He was a civilian dressed in a fine suit, his face partially hidden in the shadow of the doorway. He was lighting a cigar. The smell of the expensive tobacco filled the small room. It was a familiar smell, a smell she associated with the saloon in San Judas. The man stepped into the light. It was Silas Rourke. He smiled at her, a thin, predatory smile. "Captain," he said, his voice was a dry rustle. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The world dissolved into a nightmare of betrayal. The kind face of Captain Thorne was a mask, a cruel joke. The lockbox containing her fragile hope was now in the hands of the enemy. May felt the floor drop out from beneath her, a physical sensation of falling. Her breath came in ragged gasps. For a single terrifying moment, the old identity, the unwanted girl the jinx threatened to reclaim her. She was a fool. A naive, trusting fool who had walked into the trap with her eyes wide open. Silas Rourke took a long, slow puff of his cigar, the smoke curling from his thin lips like a contented sigh. He did not look at her with triumph or even anger. He looked at her with the mild curiosity of a man examining an insect he was about to crush. Captain Thorne, for his part, looked merely annoyed, as if this whole affair was a tedious piece of paperwork he had to complete. "It seems you have been consorting with known fugitives, Miss Bennet," Thorne said, his voice stripped of its earlier warmth and now holding the flat metallic tone of officialdom. "And you have brought stolen documents into a federal military installation. These are serious crimes." Rourke walked over to the desk and picked up the lockbox. He did not bother to open it. He knew what was inside. He patted it almost affectionately. "A commendable effort, my dear," he said, his voice a silken mockery. "But you are out of your depth. This is a game for men, not for sentimental little girls. This land is being tamed, civilized. Progress has a price, and men like your Apache friend are the price." May said nothing. There were no words. Her mind was a white void of shock. The captain cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, I see no need to press charges against you. You are clearly a distraught and confused young woman who has been manipulated by savages." He made a gesture of dismissal toward the door. "You are free to go, Miss Bennet, but I would advise you to leave this territory. There is nothing for you here." It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of supreme arrogance. They were not jailing her because they did not consider her a threat. She was nothing, a piece of dust to be brushed aside. That thought, that final casual dismissal, was what saved her. It was the spark that reignited the flame. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated her. She turned without a word and walked out of the office. She walked across the parade ground, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked out of the main gate of Fort Endicott and back into the desert. The sentry barely gave her a glance. She found Ezekiel and Hector in a small hidden arroyo a few miles from the fort where they had agreed to meet. She told them everything. She saw the hope drain from their faces, replaced by a grim, weary resignation. Hector slammed his good fist against the sandy wall of the arroyo in frustration. Ezekiel simply closed his eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "We have lost," Hector said, his voice hollow. "They have Nahota. They have the evidence. They have the army. There is nothing more we can do." Ezekiel opened his eyes. There was no surrender in them, only a deep and terrible anger. "We cannot leave him in there. Rourke will not allow him to stand trial. He will arrange for an accident, a shiv in the ribs, a faked escape attempt. Nahota will not leave that fort alive. Then we must get him out." The words came from May. They were spoken quietly, but with an unshakable certainty that made both men turn and look at her. They saw not a distraught girl, but a woman whose face was set like flint. "Get him out," Hector said incredulously. "May, we are 3 people. That is a federal fort. There are 100 soldiers in there." "She is right," Ezekiel said after a long moment, his eyes fixed on May. It is what he would do for us. And so, in the dying light of that desperate day, the most wanted woman in the Arizona Territory laid out her plan to break into a United States Army fort. It was a plan born of her own observations, her own newfound strength. She was no longer being pulled along by events. She was now the one steering the course. The rain began just after dark. It was the first rain of the monsoon season, a soft, steady downpour that turned the dust to mud and filled the air with the smell of life. It was a blessing. It would cover their sound and their tracks. They moved under the cover of the storm, 3 ghosts slipping through the wet darkness. Hector, with his uncanny silence, went first. He scaled the adobe wall of the fort near the stables, a place where the shadows were deepest. He dropped into the compound without a sound. A few minutes later, the small side gate creaked open. Ezekiel and May slipped inside. The fort was quiet. Most of the soldiers were in the barracks or the mess hall seeking shelter from the rain. The plan had 3 parts, each one a gamble. Hector would go to the stables. Ezekiel would go to the powder magazine. And May would go to the stockade. They separated, moving through the slick mud and the driving rain like spirits. May's heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but her mind was clear. She reached the small stockade at the back of the fort. It was a simple, open-air cage made of thick wooden posts. A single guard stood huddled under a small canvas awning, trying to keep his cigarette lit. Inside the cage was a lone figure sitting on the wet ground, his back against the posts. It was Nahota. She waited in the shadows, her signal to the others a small smooth stone she held in her hand. The first part of the plan exploded into action. From the stables came a sudden crashing and splintering of wood, followed by a wave of terrified whinnying. A moment later, the entire herd of cavalry horses burst from the stables, their eyes wide with panic. They galloped wildly across the parade ground, a thundering stampede that sent the lone guard at the stockade running for his life. In the chaos of the stampede, the fort's main alarm bell began to ring. Soldiers poured from the barracks, half-dressed and confused, trying to corral the horses. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the noise and the rain. In the midst of this pandemonium, the second part of the plan was executed. A bright orange light bloomed from the small stone building that was the powder magazine. Ezekiel had made sure the building was empty before he set the fire. A moment later, the magazine exploded with a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the fort. The explosion was not large enough to cause widespread damage, but it was terrifying enough to turn the chaos into a full-blown panic. Every soldier, every officer, every man in that fort was now focused on the fire and the stampede. No one was looking at the small wooden cage at the back of the compound. May ran to the stockade. The gate was secured with a heavy iron padlock. She had no key, but Ezekiel had given her a long steel pry bar. She wedged it into the hasp and threw all her weight against it. The wet wood groaned. The metal shrieked in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would not break. Then, with a final wrenching crack, the lock gave way. She pulled the gate open. Nahota was on his feet. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the flickering light of the distant fire. He was not surprised. "You should not have come," he said. His voice was low, but it carried a weight of concern that was almost an accusation. "This is my fight." May looked him directly in the eye, her own face streaked with rain and soot. "From the moment I chose to go back to San Judas, I was no longer the unwanted one," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had never known she possessed. "I am the one who chooses where I belong, and I belong here with you in this fight." A flicker of something deep and powerful passed between them, a silent understanding that was more profound than any words. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was firm and sure. Hector and Ezekiel appeared from the shadows, leading 3 horses they had managed to catch in the confusion. They mounted and rode not for the main gate, but for the breach in the wall that Hector had made near the stables. They moved through the chaos like wraiths, their escape unnoticed by the panicked soldiers. As they passed the now deserted command office, May pulled her horse to a sudden halt. The explosion had shattered the windows of the office and blown the door from its hinges. An idea, a wild and desperate gamble, took hold of her. She slid from her horse and ran inside. The room was a wreck. papers were scattered everywhere. The floor was covered in broken glass. On the floor lay the captain's desk, its drawers splintered and broken, and beside it lay the small metal lockbox Thorne had used. The force of the blast had sprung its lock. It lay open. She knelt and looked inside. Her map and the contracts were there, but there was something else, a heavy brass object. It was a seal a press used to make an official impression in wax. Around the edge were the words, United States Territorial Court. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the one thing that could give their claims the weight of federal law. It was the one thing that could force an honest investigation. Rourke and Thorne had not just stolen their evidence, they had stolen the very instrument of justice itself. She grabbed the seal and the papers. She ran back to the horses. As they rode out through the broken wall and into the freedom of the stormy night, she clutched the heavy brass seal in her hand. It was cold and hard and real. It was not a request for justice. It was a demand. Market day in San Judas was a frantic symphony of noise and dust. The main street was choked with people. Miners down from the hills with pockets full of dust and thirsts full of whiskey haggled with traders selling everything from cheap shovels to patent medicines. Ranch hands and their families mingled with a detachment of cavalry troopers whose horses were tied to the rail in front of the saloon. The air was a thick stew of smells, frying meat, cheap perfume, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present dust. Into this swirling chaos of commerce and desperation rode a small group of riders who brought with them a sudden and profound silence. May led the way. Beside her rode Nahota, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. Behind them were Ezekiel Ward and Hector Cruz, their faces set and grim. They did not ride to the saloon or the sheriff's office. They rode to the large canvas tent that had been erected in the small, dusty plaza. A simple wooden sign hung over the entrance, the United States Territorial Circuit Court. A circuit judge, a weary-looking man with spectacles and a neat gray beard named Judge Miller, was hearing a tedious dispute over a stray mule. The proceedings came to an abrupt halt as May and her companions dismounted and entered the tent. Sheriff Amos Pike and Silas Rourke, who had been observing the proceedings from the back of the tent, stiffened. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and fury. Your Honor, May's voice cut through the stunned silence. My name is May Bennett. I've come to present evidence of a conspiracy to defraud the United States government to illegally seize land from its rightful owners and to incite violence for personal profit. The judge peered at her over his spectacles, his expression one of deep skepticism. Those are very serious charges, young woman. Who are you accusing? May raised her arm and pointed a trembling but steady finger. I am accusing Sheriff Amos Pike and Mr. Silas Rourke. A wave of murmurs and whispers swept through the crowd that had gathered at the entrance of the tent. Rourke stepped forward, his face a mask of outraged innocence. Your Honor, this is absurd. This girl is a known associate of the fugitive murderer Nahota. She is a criminal herself. I am a witness, Ezekiel Ward said, stepping forward, his tall frame commanding attention. I am a former sergeant of the United States Cavalry, and I witnessed Sheriff Pike declare his intention to use Miss Bennett as bait to entrap Nahota. I am also a witness, Hector Cruz said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of conviction. I saw Sheriff Pike use a heated blade to force Miss Bennett's father to sign a fraudulent contract, and I have here a map, a copy of the official railroad survey. He unrolled the map and held it up for the judge to see. And here's another map, one drawn by Silas Rourke, showing the proposed railroad spur. As you can see, it has been deliberately rerouted to cross the sacred spring of the Apache people, so that he might seize the water rights for himself. The final piece of evidence came from May herself. She stepped forward and placed a heavy object on the judge's makeshift desk, the brass federal court seal, and she placed beside it the ledger she had taken from Rourke's office. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. This is the property of your court illegally held by Captain Thorne at Fort Endicott on behalf of Mr. Rourke, and this is Mr. Rourke's own ledger detailing every bribe and every crime. I believe you will find it makes for very interesting reading. The judge stared at the seal, then at the ledger. He looked at Rourke, whose face had gone a sickly shade of gray. The trap had been sprung. The truth was out. Rourke knew he was finished. The law had him cornered. So he chose to abandon the law entirely. He gave a sharp, almost invisible signal to the dozen or so hired guns he had planted in the crowd. A pistol shot rang out. Then another. Panic erupted. The crowd screamed and scattered. The market day descended into a battlefield. Rourke's men began firing indiscriminately into the air and toward the small group of town militia who tried to form a line. It was not a battle. It was a massacre in the making, designed to create enough chaos for Rourke to escape. Nahota moved with a speed and purpose that was breathtaking. He was not interested in the firefight. He was interested in the innocent people caught in the crossfire. He vaulted over a cart of vegetables, pulling a woman and her child to safety. He yelled to the cavalrymen who were scrambling for their horses, pointing them toward the source of the gunfire, drawing the soldiers into the fight and away from the terrified civilians. He was a whirlwind of motion, a protector, not a killer, creating a corridor through the chaos for people to flee. In the midst of the pandemonium, Sheriff Pike saw his own chance to escape justice. He lunged not for a horse, but for May. He grabbed her from behind his thick arm, locking around her throat. He dragged her backward, using her as a shield. He held a pistol to her head. "Drop your guns!" He screamed, his voice a high-pitched squeal of terror and rage. "All of you, or the girl dies." He looked directly at Nahota. "You, Apache, you will give me that book. You will let me ride out of here, or I swear I will scatter her brains all over this street." The world narrowed to that single terrifying moment. Nahota stood 30 feet away, his rifle in his hands. He saw the fear in May's eyes, but he also saw the fire. He saw the man who had tormented her entire life, now using her as his last desperate shield. Without hesitation, Nahota lowered his rifle and let it fall to the dusty ground. He raised his hands in surrender. A shot rang out, not from Pike's gun, but from one of Rourke's men on a nearby rooftop. The bullet tore through the flesh of Nahota's shoulders, spinning him around. He grunted in pain and staggered, but he did not fall. Pike laughed a ragged, horrible sound. He began to drag May backward toward a horse. He had won. But he had miscalculated. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. Not the unwanted girl from the auction block, but the woman who had broken a man out of a federal fort. As he dragged her past the church, May's hand slipped down to the hem of her dress. Her fingers found the small, 2-shot Derringer that Ezekiel had given her. She had hidden it there just in case. She did not aim for Pike. She did not want his death on her conscience. She aimed for the sky. She aimed for the bell. She pulled the trigger. The small gun bucked in her hand. The bullet flew true, striking the great iron bell with a deafening clang. The sound that had saved her once saved her again. The horse Pike was dragging her toward screamed in terror and reared up its hooves, lashing out. The sudden movement threw Pike off balance. His grip on May loosened for a single critical second. It was all she needed. She stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of her boot. He roared in pain and his arm fell away. She scrambled clear. The tide had turned. As Rourke tried to slip away toward a freight car on the new railroad siding, Ezekiel Ward appeared as if from nowhere. He tackled the smaller man with the force of a runaway train, bringing him down in a cloud of dust. He disarmed him and held him fast. The townspeople who had been cowering in doorways and under wagons now emerged. They had seen it all. They had seen the truth in the judge's tent. They had seen Nahota protect their children. They had seen the sheriff use one of their own as a shield. And they had seen that same girl save herself. A circle of silent, grim-faced men and women formed around Ezekiel and the sputtering Rourke. They formed another circle around Pike, who was now being held at gunpoint by the town's blacksmith. There would be no escape. There would be no deals. The people of San Judas had finally chosen a side. Judge Miller, his face pale but his voice firm, stepped out of his tent. He held the brass federal seal in his hand. "By the authority vested in me by the United States government, I am placing this entire rail spur under temporary injunction. And I am issuing warrants for the immediate arrest of Silas Rourke and Amos Pike, pending a full federal trial." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. May ran to Nahota's side. Tozinha was already there, pressing a cloth to his bleeding shoulder. The wound was painful but not serious. He looked at May, and a slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pride and of something much deeper. It was not quite over. A cavalry scout came galloping into town, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He rode directly to the judge's tent. He had urgent news. A telegraph message had just arrived from the east. A private army of 50 men hired by the railroad's board of directors had crossed into the territory. Their orders were to secure the railroad's investment at any cost. They were not soldiers. They were killers. And they would be in San Judas in 2 days. The sun bled across the western horizon, painting the bruised underbellies of the storm clouds in shades of violent purple and blood orange. Before them lay the playa, a vast dry lake bed that stretched for miles, a sheet of cracked porcelain under the immense and watchful sky. The air was dead still and charged with a strange energy. You could taste the lightning on the back of your tongue, a metallic tang of ozone. This was a place where the sky came down to meet the earth, and it was not always a gentle meeting. This was the ground Nahota had chosen for their final stand. It was a place he understood, a place the horses of the white men would not. The news of the approaching mercenary force had reached them that morning. 50 riders, hard men with no allegiance but to the money that paid them. They were not soldiers who followed orders. They were wolves who followed the scent of blood. To meet them in a straight fight would be madness, and so they had chosen not to fight but to lead a deadly dance. They had left a clear trail for the mercenaries to follow, a trail that led directly to the edge of the great salt flat. Nahota, Ezekiel Hector, and a dozen of the best Apache riders had positioned themselves at the far side of the playa, a small cluster of dark figures in the vast emptiness. May and Tozinha were hidden in a rocky crevice on the rim, overlooking the entire scene, their position offering them a terrifying and commanding view. They did not have to wait long. The mercenaries appeared on the far rim, a dark line of horsemen silhouetted against the dying sun. They paused for a moment, surveying the flat expanse, then spurred their horses forward, their arrogance a tangible thing. They saw a small band of fugitives trapped in the open. They saw an easy victory, an easy payday. They did not see the trap. They were halfway across the playa when the first drops of rain began to fall. They were not gentle drops. They were thick, heavy splatters that struck the hard-baked earth with a sound like pebbles being thrown on a drum. The wind rose with a sudden mournful howl sweeping across the flat, and with the rain the nature of the ground began to change. The baked clay and salt that had been as hard as rock began to soften. The cracks in the earth drank the water, and the surface turned into a slick, greasy paste. The horses began to struggle. Their hooves, which had been pounding out a confident rhythm, now slipped and slid. The easy canter became a difficult slog. The mercenaries cursed, pulling at the reins, trying to force their mounts onward. They were still a mile from their quarry, but their momentum was dying. The earth itself was fighting against them. Then the lightning came. A single bolt shot down from the sky, striking the center of the playa with a deafening crack. It was not a random strike. This was a place known to the Apache for drawing the fire of the sky. It was an anvil for the storm. Another bolt followed, and then another. The sky was ripped apart by a web of white fire. The air smelled of burnt salt. The horses screamed in terror, no longer controllable. Several riders were thrown as their mounts bucked and shied. The orderly line of attack dissolved into a chaotic mob of panicked men and animals. Now, Nahota gave the signal. His riders, who had been waiting patiently, now moved. They did not charge. They fanned out their own horses, accustomed to this treacherous ground, picking their way carefully through the mud. They were not there to kill. They were there to disable. They fired not at the men, but at the horses of the leaders crippling the command structure. They threw ropes, snaring riders and pulling them from their saddles into the thick, sticky mud. It was a battle of wits and terrain, not of bullets. Sheriff Amos Pike had come with the mercenaries, a vulture following the wolves. He had not ridden onto the playa himself, but had watched from the rim, his face a mask of fury, as he saw his plan for revenge fall apart. He saw May watching from her hiding place across the basin, the source of all his troubles. His mind consumed by a final act of spite, He raised his rifle and took careful aim. He would erase her from the world. He never fired the shot. A shadow fell over him. Hector Cruz stood behind him, his face a mask of cold fury. Hector's good arm shot out not with a knife but with the heavy butt of his pistol. It connected with the side of Pike's head with a sickening thud. The sheriff crumpled to the ground unconscious, his last act of cowardice thwarted. On the playa below, Silas Rourke was in a similar state of panic. He had been smarter than the others, staying near the edge of the salt flat. He had also been more prepared. Near a small outcropping of rock, he had hidden a wagon containing extra ammunition and supplies. He scrambled toward it now, his only thought to escape. As he reached the wagon, he turned and raised his own pistol, intending to fire on the Apache who were now rounding up the disarmed mercenaries. He too was denied his final act of violence. A bolt of lightning of unimaginable intensity struck the rock outcropping not 10 feet from him. The air itself seemed to explode. The concussion threw Rourke backward into the mud. The superheated air ignited the black powder in the ammunition wagon. The wagon disappeared in a ball of orange and black fire, a final punctuation mark on a life built on greed and destruction. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The setting sun broke through the clouds, flooding the playa with a soft golden light. The scene was one of surreal stillness. The great salt flat was a sea of mud littered with fallen horses and disarmed men. Some were stuck fast, their legs held by the thick clay like insects in amber. The battle was over. The victory was complete, but the final act was yet to play out. Ezekiel Ward rode to the center of the chaos. He looked at the defeated mercenaries, at their faces streaked with mud and fear. He could have left them there. He could have let the desert claim them. It would have been a just end. But he was no longer the man who had followed orders and burned a village. He dismounted and walked to the nearest man who was struggling in the mud up to his waist. He reached out his hand. "Come on," he said. His voice was not angry or triumphant. It was just the voice of a man. "We will get you out." One by one, Nahota's riders followed his lead. They began the slow, difficult work of pulling their defeated enemies from the mud. It was an act of grace so profound, so unexpected, that the mercenaries could only stare in stunned silence. They had come to kill, and they were being saved. The hatred that had driven them was being answered with a mercy they could not comprehend. Later, as the last of the twilight faded from the sky, May and Nahota stood together on the rim overlooking the valley. The air was cool and clean, washed by the rain. The world was quiet. He reached out and gently touched the side of her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. He rested his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of complete and perfect intimacy, a silent communion of two souls who had found each other in the fire. "We will live," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her skin. "We will live a life the mountain will remember." It was a promise not just of love, but of purpose. A promise to build something that would last, something that would honor the land that had saved them. A rider approached them in the gathering dark. It was a young cavalryman from the town carrying a message from Judge Miller. The judge had sent a telegraph to the territorial capital. The evidence was undeniable. A full federal commission was being assembled to investigate the railroad and the land grants. Rourke and Pike would face a federal trial. And there was more. The initial ruling from the judge was that the Apache band under Nahota's leadership had a legitimate claim to the sacred spring. They would be granted the right to negotiate a formal treaty to protect it, but the law was a white man's law. The negotiations would require a liaison, a person of trust who was a legal resident of the territory, a white citizen who could speak for them and translate their words and their ways for the commissioners. The rider looked at May. "The judge sent me to find you. He said you were the only one who could do it." May looked at Nahota. She saw in his eyes not a demand, but a question. Her whole life she had been an outsider, a person who belonged nowhere. Now two worlds were asking her to be their bridge. Her journey was not over. It was just beginning, and for the first time she knew exactly where she belonged. The season of cool winds came to the high country. The land, scarred by fire and washed by rain. began to heal. By the sacred spring, life found its rhythm again. It was a rhythm of peace, but it was a watchful peace, a quiet earned through struggle. The summer camp of Nahota's people was not a fortress, but it was a sanctuary. Children who had known only flight now laughed as they learned to fletch arrows. Their small bows a game that was also a lesson in survival. Women worked in the shade of the cottonwood trees, their hands busy slicing strips of jerky to dry in the sun. Their low conversations a gentle murmur that blended with the sound of the spring. The men mended harnesses and planned the autumn hunt, their movements unhurried, their eyes no longer constantly scanning the horizon for danger. May had found her place in this rhythm. She had chosen her path. She was the bridge, the voice that could speak the language of both worlds. The days were long and filled with work. She spent hours with Tosinha, learning the names of the plants and their uses, her hands becoming stained with the colors of the earth. She spent hours with Nahota and the elders, listening to their stories, trying to understand a history that was not written in books but was carried in the memory of the people. And she spent hours with the heavy legal papers sent by Judge Miller, translating the cold, hard language of the law into concepts that could be understood by people who saw the world not as a collection of properties, but as a web of life. She did not leave. She stayed and helped Nahota and his people place the first of the new boundary stones. They were not the sharp wooden stakes of the railroad, but great, smooth river stones, carried by hand to mark the edges of the living water, the land that the commission had agreed would be protected. It was hard work under the hot sun, but with every stone they placed, May felt as if she were helping to build not a wall, but a foundation for a future. Change came to the others as well. A letter arrived for Ezekiel Ward, bearing the official seal of the United States Army. It was a full pardon for his desertion, granted in light of his testimony against Captain Thorne and his role in uncovering the conspiracy. The Army offered him reinstatement, his old rank restored. He read the letter, folded it neatly, and used it to light the charcoal in the small forge he had built near the edge of the new, slowly growing settlement that was replacing the ashes of San Judas. He had no desire to wear a uniform again. He opened a small blacksmith shop, and his first customers were the children of the town. He did not teach them to shoot. He taught them how to care for a tool, how to respect its power. He taught them that a gun was a thing to be understood and maintained, not a thing to be used in anger. His hands, which had once brought death, were now teaching a new generation about safety and responsibility. Hector Cruz, his arm now healed and bearing a long, pale scar, went back to Sonora for a time. He returned not with horses or cattle, but with a small, wrinkled woman with eyes as bright and sharp as a bird's, his mother. Together they opened a small cantina on the main street of the recovering town. It was not a saloon for whiskey and trouble. It was a place for food, for the slow-cooked stews and fresh tortillas of his childhood. It became a place where the lines between worlds blurred. Vaqueros and miners sat at the same tables as Apache hunters who had come to trade. They broke bread together, and in the shared language of good food, they found a common ground. The railroad did not go away. The main line was still being built, a great iron artery across the land, but the spur line, the one that had threatened the spring, was gone. Silas Rourke and Amos Pike were gone, their names now a cautionary tale told by old men in the evenings. The town of San Judas was slowly finding its soul again, its people chastened by the violence and sobered by the truth. One evening, as the first stars began to appear in the deep purple sky, a great campfire was lit in the center of the Apache camp. It was a night of celebration, of gratitude for the peace that had been won. The sound of a wooden flute drifted on the cool night air, a simple, haunting melody that spoke of sorrow and of hope. May sat a little apart from the main circle, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth on her face. She felt a presence beside her, and she knew without looking that it was Nahota. He sat down beside her, their shoulders touching. They did not speak for a long time. There was no need. The silence between them was as comfortable and as full of meaning as any conversation. He looked into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. He remembered the first day he saw you. He said, his voice a low rumble. In the dust, on that wooden platform, they had given you a name to hold you down. He turned and looked at her, his eyes holding the light of the fire and the depth of the night sky. They called you Unwanted, he said, his voice soft. I looked once and knew. You chose your destiny. He had taken his first pronouncement, a statement of fate, and transformed it. He had given her back her own story, not as a thing that had happened to her, but as a thing she had created. It was the greatest gift he could have given her. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and in the circle of his arm, she was finally home. But the world did not stop turning. The story did not end. Far in the distance, on a high ridge overlooking the valley, 3 figures could be seen. They were small and indistinct in the gathering twilight, their forms made thin and wavering by the wind. They were holding instruments, a transit, and a surveyor's chain, a new survey team for a new railroad route. They were watching the camp, watching the fire. They were a reminder that peace is never a destination, but a journey, a reminder that a future must be protected, that a home must be guarded. The story of this land was not over. It was still being written in the firelight and in the sound of the eternal spring. A story of a guarded peace, a promise not of forever, but of for now. Thank you for listening to our story, and we invite you to comment below with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.